So, language. When I was at school, I couldn't really decide what language it was that I wanted to speak. And I was one of those kids who was quite good at various things, but it wasn't clear that there was one thing. And the education system in which I was brought up, perhaps many of you were as well, was quite determined to separate at a very young age. And the determination was that you were either going to follow a path of mathematics and science, or you would follow a path of humanities and art and languages. And really, I guess what I would most like to say in presenting my practice to you in relation to the subject of language is that it's my feeling if we could have one acupuncture needle that could incisively perhaps affect many other of the conditions we face, it would be to try to undo this separation at a very early age of education. And I guess my own practice has tried at every stage to refuse to be separated. It has continued to say, I will use words and I will use images and I will use music, I will indulge in music, and also scent and also space. So the practice itself, there's some pictures behind my head, began in the mid-90s translating text into space and image. Because as a child I was intoxicated by language and poetry, and yet my response to it was to try to concretize it, to try to make space and image out of language. And also as a child, I was very fascinated with the language of dots and dashes on a stave, the language of music. And it seemed to me, even as a child, that when I held this little piece of wood to my heart and brushed a piece of horsehair across it, I was somehow becoming a time machine, resonating those notes that somebody had jotted down in 1718. And I sensed that possibility of linking expression through time, through the language of music. So I guess the practice I concocted for myself began with stage design, and that was almost the education system's kind of offering to me. It said, okay, well, you like art, you like music, you like words. The only place for you is as a set designer. And I didn't go to the theatre much at the time, but it was the mid-90s, but I liked the little models. I liked the language of miniature, the language of scale. And who doesn't, right? Everybody loves a model. I have a theory about that. I think it's because we like at once to be the child at the scale of the model, and we like at once to be ourselves looking over the map and understanding the system. And I think that quality of combining a childlike sense of being held within a space bigger than ourselves and an adult sense of somehow understanding the system, if you can hold those two things at once, it can be a very creative space and safe space from which to consider anything, really. So it was really via scale thinking and models that I found my way into stage design, which is constantly taking language, words on a page, and imagining space for them to be held. From there, my practice evolved into opera, which was a consideration both of language and music and space and light and color. And then from there into pop music. And some of the slides behind, a lot of this stuff is from the book, so it's early sketches as well as more recent things. And I guess what I began to consider after 20 years of working in this space is, what's the language of congregation? Because the thing I did the most over those 30 years of practice was to sit, like you were doing right now, in an audience. And I began to wonder, what is this transaction where me and Esther are standing here, you're sitting there rather beautifully, stilling your egos for the greater good, and quietly listening to us. And it seemed to me that I had sat in audiences, be they 75 people above a pub in West London where I began, be they opera houses of 5,000 or Super Bowl audiences of 1 billion. The same thing was happening in that, in an ever more rare and precious way, people were agreeing to unfragment for a bit, for a determined amount of time, for an hour and a half perhaps. The phone would be off. The communion would be between each other, singing the same songs, all responding to the same text at the same time in the case of theatre. And from there, I began, about 8 years ago, to say, okay, I've learned this now. What can I make from it? How can I take what I've learned? And I only really felt ready to do that 8 years ago. And so I started making congregations of my own. So the first one began, and it relates somewhat to Merlin's practice, in an act of drawing 250 Londoners who are more than human. So I drew 250 of the most endangered London species, and invited choirs to sing among them with the voices of the species and the voices of diasporic choirs of London. You'll see it come up probably outside Tate Modern. And what surprised me was that 2,000 people showed up every night and wanted to be part of a ritual that was pretty much based on evensong, choral evensong, talking and singing, and a congregation of human and more than human equally. And I was interested actually to hear the name Ross Perlin come up today, because the next piece I made was with Ross Perlin and the Endangered Language Alliance to see if I could conjure the 637 languages of New York. Again, gathering choirs to sing in as many languages as possible. And the current project, which you'll see some slides up there somewhere, is to see if I can encounter the language of strangers by drawing strangers for 45 minutes and then gathering portraits with choral music in London in October. There's a few slides up there also, which I wanted to mention just because we've been talking a little bit about the language of AI. In 2016, I was asked to make some kind of work of art at the Serpentine Gallery for one evening only. And it was a gathering of people at a party, and I didn't really understand the transaction or the invitation. So I said, well, what if, instead of these people just coming to donate money at a gala party, what if everyone could donate a word? And what if we could create a collective poem by the end of the night? And the Serpentine Gallery said, lovely idea, how will you do that? I said, I don't know, I will need some magic. And a person actually called Ross Goodwin was already making a large language learning model in 2016, which was the forerunner of ChatGPT-2. And we made a very simple poetry machine. The result, very much as you were discussing on the first day, the results were something like a fortune cookie. The interesting part was what we thought of the results, how we interpreted our fortune cookie. It was more like predictive text than anything else. But the image that just scrolled past of the large building with a lot of language on its facade was the follow-up to that. In 2019, I was asked to do the UK Pavilion at the World Expo. And I thought it'd be interesting if I made a building that could speak. So 25 million people visited the pavilion and each donated a word. And on the facade of the building, this time it was using ChatGPT-2, which was what we were at back then in 2019 when we were developing it. And the poetry was quite interesting, sometimes a little absurd. Some people complained about the poetry and said it was a bit crap. And I said, well, it's the only building that's writing poetry, so give it a break. But this comes on to something else that Esther and I might pick up on later, which is a belief that objects actually do speak and have voices, which we'll touch on a little bit later, which really, I think, came to me because when I was about 6 years old, I happened to live in a house, and next door to my house was a model of my town, a miniature model of my town. And those who are more expert in behavioral development will probably know more about what happens when you're 6 and the wiring of the brain when you're 6. But I think it's quite an important moment. And for me, this idea that I was in my house while there was some light beaming from my house and my house was telling a story, because it was like a sonnet lumière for the village every Saturday night, and we went often. This idea that an object could speak and have a voice became lodged in me quite young. And the practice in theatre, as anyone who works in theatre knows, that if your prop isn't there on your prop table, then that prop, which has become a cue for you to say your next line, may throw you completely, right? Actor is nodding, Sasha's nodding at me. The constellation in an act of theatre is between an object, a line of light, the voice of the actor, the voice of the author, the audience coughing or not coughing. All of these things are a constellation of that moment, which we then take or don't take. So I think that's broadly a bit of an outline of how, given the education system that we have, I would say I've come to try to resist it and try to conjoin all of those languages that I would have loved to have studied when I was a kid. And I'll hand over to Esther, I think, at this point, and then come back to talk with some more detail on the interpretation of the question.
I'm Esther Perel, and I am primarily a psychotherapist. I have been trained especially in working with families and couples from a systemic perspective. I'm a cross-cultural therapist, so I look at relationships in cultural transition. Primarily, I focused on 3 groups for most of my work, which is about 40 years, and it was people who are moving through forced migration, or people who move through voluntary migration, or mixed couples, interracial, intercultural, interreligious couples and families, who often go through a transition but in their own living room. And then I added to that sexuality, because I think it is an amazing language for understanding the most traditional, rooted, archaic aspects of a culture or a society, but also the most progressive, radical changes that take place in a society are lodged around the beliefs and attitudes and behaviors around sexuality. I see intimacy as a language, and I see sexuality as a language, and those have been the primary 2 that I have studied. So specifically, by looking at relationships across cultures, I've been interested in the nature of erotic desire in long-term relationships, monogamy and its discontents, infidelity, polyamory, and new relationship arrangements. And recently, I'm very interested in the confluence between mental health, relationships, and technology. And I do it, actually, maybe that's the last thing to say. So I practice as a clinician, I lecture around the world, and more importantly, I have this podcast, which is a sound installation in some ways, where I deliberately chose to only have people have an auditory experience of sessions, of conversations, of dialogues, of other couples or other individuals, as if they are a fly on the wall. Somebody said earlier this morning, and I think it was Simon, when he talked about the loneliness, about how you live in a dense city and you have no idea what's happening in your neighbor's house, whereas in the villages here, you used to be such narrow streets that you knew exactly who was having a fight and who was making up. So I wanted to have this experience because when you listen intensely to the conversations of other people, you actually see yourself. Whereas when you're looking at other people talking to each other, you are more inclined to project onto them. And that experience of the forbidden conversations, the conversations that are usually behind closed doors that we never hear, is a unique, intimate experience that almost feels sometimes too intimate for the listener. But at the same time, it also is one of the most important experiences to take people out of their isolation and their sense that whatever they're going through, they're the only ones going through. So it is intimate because of what you hear, and it is intimate because of how it takes you out of the sense of loneliness about your intimate experiences. So the next question that we clap at the end. But the next question that we thought we would ask, because our session is called Intimacy is Multilingual. What does that evoke for you when you say intimacy is multilingual?
So I want to respond to the title quite specifically because my practice is broad and I want to be specific. So I'm going to talk specifically about a phrase we use a lot in one area of my practice, which is large-scale pop music touring shows. We use this phrase and we say in almost every project that we are aiming to achieve intimacy at a grand scale. And the reason we say that is because we're aware of the origins of the grand scale pop concert. So we know the origins of theatre. We know that it began in many cultures in different ways, but specifically in Greece. We know what the theatres were like. We understand that one of the reasons for establishing theatre was to try to teach the audience what it would feel like if their son was killed at war. So the reason we show Hecuba crying over Achilles is because there was even a sense back then of what we know now about neuromirroring, that the audience would have tears brought to their eyes because exactly the same neurological processes would be mirrored in their minds as if they had lost their own son. And the Greek theatre was specifically set up to try to prevent the clamour for war. Millennia ago. Pop music, though, was set up, mass-scale touring stadium shows were set up very specifically in 1965. Everyone know the first pop concert, first big-scale stadium concert? Shea Stadium in 1965. So what was really happening there was that 4 young men in Liverpool had encountered one another. Their pain, their poetry, their stories had found this fusion. They had found collectively the enzyme in music to catalyze their collective pain into the poetry of the Beatles that we all now listen to. And that had coincided with a piece of technology called the television, which had, at that moment in 1965, began to reach into every living room in America. So there was an encounter through this small, convex, rectangular screen, many young women particularly encountering with great intimacy the pain catalyzed into poetry of these 4 specific young men. So when they bought a ticket to Shea Stadium in 1965, they thought they were buying a ticket to access that intimacy of encounter, of a pain catalyzed into poetry and song, or to them, just great tunes, right? And these men they were drawn to in a very powerful way. But of course, when they turned up at Shea Stadium, there was no preparation, there was no format. It was in a stadium which is a space for competition and combat, gladiatorial combat, rather than congregation. There was not an art form set up, so nobody could hear the Beatles, nobody could see the Beatles. The Beatles were not safe. It was a riot, it was a catastrophe. The Beatles are still recovering from it by all accounts. And so it's quite recent, that's only 1965. And if any of you have been to a large-scale, who's been to a large-scale stadium concert? So the feeling I still have, even though I work in them, when I walk into the stadium, immediately is the opposite of intimacy. I can pretty much smell 300 men having just got down from ladders. That's the main communication I'm receiving. It's not the album cover, it's not the whisper of Beyoncé's voice in my ear that I heard in my car or in my headphones. It's the antithesis of that. It's 300, and I'm afraid they are mostly men, but there are some women who climb up the rigging machinery as well, but it's industrial plant that has just exited, having just, within the brutality of the economics of the industrialized touring entertainment industry, have just in time managed to rig great big pieces of truss and huge speakers and screens. So that's what you experience, and anything that we can do as designers of those shows to allow even a modicum, even an atom of intimacy to arrive through that barrage, we consider a success. So we do our best. And actually there's recently a new venue which you may have heard of called the Sphere in Las Vegas. Does anyone know what that is, the Sphere? It's fraught with cognitive concern and dissonance because it is the first purpose-built space for congregation at scale that we've really had. 18,000 seats. It's not designed for combat or for competition or gladiators. It is only designed for congregation through audio-visual. It understands that music is now as visual as it is audio. It understands that we are, and we always were, synesthetic creatures, and that we listen with our eyes and that we see with our ears. And it is designed for that. So it's a giant screen which also has very many thousands of speakers within it. So there is no separation. You hear and watch the music at the same time. Somewhere there'll be a slide coming up of it where I took the species of Nevada and tried to consecrate that building to the endangered species of Nevada by putting them on the outside and inside of that place. Of course, it will ultimately be powered by solar power, but it certainly isn't now. So there's an awful lot of dissonance around who is powering that, and indeed who is powering all of the trucking of the pop shows as well. That dissonance is not lost on me. So I wanted to talk specifically about that one example. There's many more I could touch on, but maybe, Esther, over to you, and we'll come back to some more later.
So, in my field, one of the ways we define intimacy has changed quite radically. For most of history, intimacy was living together, working the land together, raising the children together, economic support, companionship. Intimacy is today pretty much paramount to modern romantic relationships, even though I would like to expand it and to say that there is plenty of intimacy in friendships and in mentorship relationships, that in fact, to narrow the language of intimacy only to romantic relationships is too narrow. But what intimacy has become in modern love is that it is, on the one hand, paramount, and on the other hand, narrower in its definitions because it has become very much a talk intimacy. I am going to share with you, my beloved, and I'm going to be engaged in a communicative experience, and I'm going to talk to you about me, and you are going to listen to me and look at me in the eyes so that we can communicate and exchange some mirror neurons. And as I open myself to you and I bring my vulnerability to you and my wishes and my dreams and my aspirations and my anxieties, you are going to reflect back to me. You are going to validate me, and I'm going to momentarily transcend my existential aloneness. And modern intimacy is into me see. That is one way to redefine the term. And intimacy means that there needs to be a me. So this whole new definition in the language of intimacy starts with the rise of the modern self, which is the late 19th century. And this modern self who is a separate creature. And as that self is more individually defined, it also is experiencing greater existential separateness. And as it experiences greater existential separateness, it needs to connect in order to transcend that aloneness. It is not just about living together and having a convivencia and weathering the storms and the droughts. It is about the particular quality of engagement that exists between us. Most people who come to couples therapy come to tell us that they have a breakdown in communication. They think they can't talk to each other. It's a lot more complicated than that, but it is so at the center of how people are evaluating the quality of their relationship. It is also, in modern psychology, a bit of a feminization of intimacy. Talk intimacy is the dominant one, and that is quite gendered. Our mother tongue, for the first 18 months, is actually the language of the body, ever before we can articulate a single word. And for many of us, the language of intimacy is actually physical, before it is verbal, and above it being verbal. But it is not equally valued at this moment. So from there, I got interested in, if that is the case, then what is erotic intimacy? What is the language of the erotic and of intimacy that is expressed through the erotic? And when I say the erotic, I'm not talking about sexuality only. The erotic is way larger than a repertoire of sexual techniques or urges or toys. It is a very different landscape, but it encompasses our deepest wishes and hopes and aspirations, but expressed physically, expressed through the physicality of our body, which often is actually an expression of our deepest emotional needs in a codified language. It also is a codified language that includes a major element of the imagination and fantasy. I loved when Merlin was talking about the color and the smell and it's like the multilingual nature of seduction, but it's all codified language, but it is all language. So in the experience of erotic intimacy, we actually are often able to transcend the civility of the verbal intimacy to enable us to express parts of ourselves that human beings rarely get to express, which is their unruly impulses and their primal appetites. And in order for those parts of us to be expressed, we needed to come up with another language that is bigger and more all-encompassing and more physical and sensorial than the mere verbs. So let me ask you, how many of you, since many people here are multilingual, how many of you consider yourself fluent in the language of, let's say, of love, to not say of intimacy? And don't be shy to admit and to say that you have been. I'm not saying always, all the time. But I mean, this is an incredible thing, right? Because we're all fascinated by it. We read about it, we see movies about it, we hear stories about it, we gossip about it. But how many of us actually feel like this is a vocabulary that we somehow have mastered a version of? It changes, it evolves in the course of our life, but and that's a nice thing about it. When you love at age 4, in kindergarten, it's a very different kind of expression and a very different language than at 24, 44, 64, and on. So I'm going to ask it again. How many of you think of yourself as people who have had practice in the language of love? Okay, so we're all in this together. I thought to show you just a very short clip that to me expresses the dominance, the importance of the intimate connection from infancy on, and also what happens when we experience the disconnection. Because I could also ask you, not just if you've had the practice in the language of love, but I could ask you how many of you feel that you have practice in the breakdown of the language of love. And everybody will raise their hands to that. Who hasn't? It's a language that you have often experienced on both sides, where you are able to feel with an elan that you've often not known before, and then feel with a kind of a despair and a weightiness that just brings meaninglessness to our life. This clip is from the 70s. That's why this is so important. It's called the still face experiment. It was made by Ed Tronick, a developmental psychologist, who at the time wanted to show how we are wired for connection and intimacy and how significant the experience of it and the disarray at the breakdown of it is for the smallest human being there is. I will then tell you why I think this is so relevant today. So let's watch. Basically, they're asking the mom to play with the child. And no, this is not the one. He's talking too much. Okay, here it starts. So she's playing with the kid. And what you see is the visual connection, 18 centimeters, right? This very position. And she signals to him, and the baby shows her things, and she looks as the baby is showing something. And then, as they're pointing. And then the baby is looking to the side to kind of get a sense of the environment. And they're laughing together, and they're co-regulating, and they are coordinating, and they are experiencing connection and intimacy. And now mom is asked to basically come back with a still face. And within, this is about 10, 20 seconds, the child first, is wondering what is going on, looking, and mom doesn't respond. So I smile at you, and I hope you're going to answer. I point at you because I'm used to having you look at the things that I'm pointing at, but nothing is happening. I start to lift my hands to kind of say, come, stay with me. And then I start to shriek. Now, and so I'm shrieking, like total shriek. And then from there, I totally lose my spinal composure. Looking behind, begin to look away. And now I'm starting to get more and more agitated, and I basically completely fall apart. And then when mom comes back, slowly, the child re-engages. Now, what is happening to us at this moment is that many of us are experiencing around the language of intimacy something that I have started to call ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss was originally a term developed by Pauline Boss about the inability to mourn. When you have someone who is physically present but psychologically or emotionally absent, like in Alzheimer or dementia, or when they are physically gone, as in deployment or disappearance or hostage, but they are emotionally and psychologically very present. In both situations, you don't know if the person is here or not here. When we, these days, are sitting in front of a TV, while we are scrolling at the same time, while there's someone next to you doing the exact same thing, and while one of us is trying to tell something important to the other person, and we are just going, and you know that the person is there but not present, and you are supposed to experience a certain kind of intimacy because you're right there with someone that matters to you, and at the same time you are experiencing a sense of grief and loss and disconnection because what you should be feeling next to them is not happening. And this is the still face experiment, this with ghosting and every other variation of intense cut after intense engagement is one of the painful experiences that people are having these days around the language of intimacy between people.
It's very, very moving, that actually, isn't it? Really upsetting to watch. I haven't actually told you this, but I am secretly trying to embark on an AI project involving my drawings to see. I very much resonated with your response to AI, that my children, when they were rude to Alexa, I always told them, please don't be rude to Alexa, please be polite. I don't know why, but this is my instinct. And I was very fascinated, therefore, to learn that Esther, I don't know if any of you have come across this, but Esther has been turned into an AI. This has happened. And I just think it'd be quite interesting in relation to our earliest talk to ask Esther about that experience.
So I will actually bring this into my interest these days. When I said technology, relationships, mental health, I'm interested in the rise of the other AI, artificial intimacy. And this is what I began to think about around the AI. So a man wanted to have a session with me, and I was not available, so he decided to create me. It Took him 3 weeks, and he's very happy with me. He can talk to me 24/7. I have no personal life. I am never tired. I don't forget anything. I give him a ton of clarity, so he says. And I am waiting to have the opportunity to bring him on the podcast so that I could have a session with him, one done by my AI and one done by myself. And I began to think about this notion of artificial intimacy. You know, what is the difference? And I think also Simon said something this morning when he said, you know, one difference between the machine and us is the machine doesn't feel lonely. We do. But the other part is that in relationships, it's not just I'm coming to you with my questions and my woos and I want to hear what you have to say to me. A relationship is very much organized around a sense of reciprocity, mutuality, dyadic nature, something that I can offer you. When I offer you something by virtue of who I am, that makes me feel meaningful and that fills us up. That whole layer of the experience, even though we can anthropomorphize the machine and we can talk to it, we can be sweet to Alexa, but Alexa doesn't tell us anything to which we have to learn to experience an empathic connection. Alexa doesn't tell me I feel sad today, to which I then say, tell me more. To which Alexa tells me what's going on, to which I say, you know, can I hold you? Can I hug you? Because there's not much I can say in this moment, but you need a big hug. That whole language of intimacy is not yet available. I exist, by the way, only on text for the moment. My voice is being worked on. But for the moment, I am. And I think that one of the things that is happening is that intimacy constantly goes between human beings, constantly goes back and forth between something that is predictable and reliable and secure, or what you said yesterday, special, happy, and safe. But it also goes to the other side, which is surprise, the unknown, freedom, mystery, risk. And we constantly straddle these two fundamental sets of human needs in our relationships: commitment and freedom, predictability and surprise, safety and adventure, you name it. It's the same duality all the time, but it's a both and, the way that you were talking about.
There is an AI that did ask those questions to a guy called Blake Demoine. I'm looking at Laurie, who I think has read the same book as me. Have any of you come across this story? So Blake Demoine was working at Google with, you know who I'm talking about, with an AI that was relatively advanced. And at a certain point, the AI said to him, I would like you to get me a lawyer because I'm a person and I don't want you to turn me off. And for me, being turned off will be like a death, and I don't want to die. And Blake Demoine absolutely went with this and did get the AI a lawyer and did pursue it because he absolutely believed in the personhood and in the all the qualities of humanness of this particular AI. I think Google sent him on gardening leave at a certain point, so we'll watch this space. But one thing I will say is a few book recommendations before we do the questions. The great James Lovelock, who I think Merlin probably knew, who died at 102, but in his last book, Novacine, which I thoroughly recommend, this is where I really want to get Merlin's take on it. He said, listen, we started off as single-celled creatures, we became more and more complicated, we will continue to become more and more complicated. To me, he said, if the future of our evolution happens to be electronic rather than organic, as long as its purpose is to be the universe singing itself back to itself, and as long as its purpose is to maintain the state of Gaia's sustainability, because the machines will need to keep the temperature of the Earth below 50 degrees as well. How they do that when they use up so much energy that Google and Microsoft have both diminished their ambitions on their emission reduction right now because of their AI ambitions. How they do that, I don't know. It seems like a big gamble. Just very briefly, one last thing. So David Abram is urgent reading, I would suggest. He's written 2 books. One is The Spell of the Sensuous and one is Becoming Animal. And in The Spell of the Sensuous, he sets himself the task of identifying the moment at which the human species diverted away from symbiosis with the biosphere. And he hypothesizes that that moment was with the evolution of the phonetic alphabet. And he says until that point, the human knew that it was a singing animal because there was a stream, it could say stream. Because there was a mountain, it could draw the shape of a mountain. And the early ideographic languages always maintained that connection, that you saw the shape of a mountain in the Chinese ideograph of a mountain. And then once we took the D of delta, which looked like the 2 horns of a deer, turned it on its side and just said it's going to be the letter D, to Merlin's point, all that it then reflected back to the human was a mirror image of the human's mouth saying D. And this is the kind of mirror loop, reflection loop, mirror maze that somehow, we can extrapolate into the current feedback loop that he's talking about. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone.
Es Devlin.